One of the crucial factors in determining whether charter change will succeed or not is the public's perception regarding the motives behind it. Are its proponents really sincere in bringing about much needed change for ordinary Filipinos? Or are they simply looking out for their own interests? On this edition of The Cusp, we're going to examine the case for federalism in the country. Is it justified, or is it just a cover for unwinding the democratic system of checks and balances that have been painstakingly restored over 3 decades ago? When President Duterte spoke before an assembly of local government officials, he expressed his frustration with the current setup of our Constitution, that he said needed change to root out various forms of corruption. He said that one term of office for him was not enough. To both his supporters and critics alike, this was code for removing our system of checks and balances to enable a strong leader like himself to effect change as quickly and drastically as possible. For his supporters, nothing short of a complete overhaul of the 1987 Constitution was needed. But for his critics, not one word, syllable, or punctuation mark must be touched, lest it pave the way for one-man rule. Having a strong leader in Malacanang has historically created a stable environment which supports growth. Thus, when we've had strong leadership in the palace, people have tried to extend the leader's term of office, as was the case under President Ramos, then Mrs. Arroyo, and now Mr. Duterte. This is the reason why many oppose any attempt to change the Constitution. It's become synonymous with term extension. The question, however, is what change has President Duterte really instituted to deserve term extension? By his own admission, the president has said that his war on drugs, crime, and corruption has failed. He promised to rid the country of these within his first 6 months in office. But now he says he's underestimated the scale of the problems and needs more than one term to fix them. There's now a strong belief that the problems confronting our republic are much too great, complex, and confounding to our national leaders and institutions. Whether it's fighting corruption, criminality, or decongesting our cities, we tried dealing with them through virtue under Daang Matuwid, and saw what a failure that was. So many feel that enabling a leader with emergency powers is the way to deal with them. We're caught between a rock and a hard place. If we rely on our current setup the way it is, the problems will only fester. But if we empower a strong man to deal with them, then in time, he might not be accountable to the people anymore and abuse his powers. Furthermore, as we discovered under Marcos and perhaps now under Duterte, empowering a strong man might not fix the problems of the country either. So what should we do? Does dealing with these perennial problems effectively necessarily mean making governments less accountable to the people? An effective government that is accountable and observes the rule of law. These are the 3 ingredients for building a modern state, according to Francis Fukuyama, in The Origins of Political Order. If Mrs. Arroyo and President Duterte represent the strong state, or matatag na republika, then the Aquinos and his supporters represent democratic accountability, or daang matuwid. Rule of law is the missing ingredient, as the 2 camps battle it out. Their enmity is but an illusion, in my view. They're simply approaching the same goal of building a modern state from different angles, and appeal to different constituents with varying preferences and views on life. But both are needed. You need democratic accountability and effective governance to build a modern state. With federalism, however, there's an opportunity to make our democracy work more effectively, that is, produce results while observing democratic accountability. How, you might ask? Well, the political philosopher Montesquieu in the 18th century said that democracy, the kind of self rule which was invented by the Greeks, could only flourish within small republics. The problem with small states, however, as in the case of Athens in ancient Greece, was that they become susceptible to invasion by larger powers. The problem with large republics, on the other hand, is that they become unwieldy and governments become less accountable to the people, more prone to corruption, as per what happened to the Roman Republic when it grew to become an empire. The solution that Montesquieu came up with was for a federation of smaller republics to be formed, where the constituent subnational governments would be closer to the people and act as an intermediary power to counter any tendency towards despotism from the central government. This was the rationale adopted by the American Federalists in justifying a stronger central government in 1788 under a federalist system compared to the previously loose confederation of states that they had since 1781. When you reflect on this, you might consider that some of our regions have grown so large, as in the case of Greater Manila, that managing them requires having a powerful executive who can override the parochial interests of its constituent parts, namely the 13 mayors that make up the region. Some provinces, on the other hand, might have too sparse a population or have too little economic clout to gain the attention of our national economic development planners, unless, of course, they band together. This problem is dealt with to a certain extent by regional development councils made up of provincial governors. But these RDCs merely wield recommendatory power to the national government on what the regional infrastructure development plans should be. They don't have full autonomy to act on their own, and they suffer from parochialism and lack of political mandates from the people to exercise such functions. In both instances, there are coordination failures in our present setup, which could be addressed by granting regional autonomy down from the central government or aggregating power up from the local level to meet these challenges. Contrary to the caricature painted by some critics that the Bayanihan Constitution drafted by Duterte's Consultative Commission would cause a disintegration of the country, or that it would exacerbate inequality across regions, the cooperative design of the Bayanihan Federal Constitution would actually promote greater engagement from the citizenry, who would no longer feel that government is too distant or disempowered to deal with their problems. In other words, you get better, more effective governance through regional autonomy that is also more directly accountable to the people. So the false choice between stronger, more effective government and democratic accountability is solved through a federal model. Under such a model, the internal revenue allotments, which currently go to local government units, would be lifted from 40% to 50% of all revenues collected by the government, including royalties from the extraction of natural resources. On top of that, there'd be an equalization fund set up with no less than 3% of the annual budget. This would help correct not just for the vertical fiscal imbalances between the national and local level, but help fix the interregional horizontal fiscal imbalances, or the inequity by which richer regions gain from the present system compared to poorer regions. The Bayanihan Constitution states that this equalization fund, shall be distributed based on the needs of each region, with priority to those that require support to achieve financial viability and economic sustainability. Devolving powers to regional governments would make them much more responsible and accountable for the development that occurs or doesn't occur in their region. As part of the Bayanihan Constitution's division of labor, regional governments will be responsible for their own development planning, transport, housing, and infrastructure. There would be no need to give the president emergency powers, as the problems of traffic, garbage, and other services would be handled by local regional executives. These executives and their cabinet would be members of a regional assembly directly elected by the people, as per the Bayanihan Constitution. So, for the proponents of a parliamentary form of government, take heart. This will mean that our regions would observe a parliamentary setup, while the national government would be presidential. In other words, it would be hybrid, uniquely Filipino, not French, German, or British. By all accounts, the Philippines has been approximating federalism through greater local autonomy since this was enshrined in the 1987 Constitution. Its framers defined it as a kind of maximum decentralization short of federalization. This is why many scholars have noted that the Philippines already enjoys greater local autonomy within its unitary setup than some federal states. The irony is that under the presidency of Rodrigo Duterte, a self-styled strongman, the push towards greater devolution through federalism is occurring. But many who ought to be on the side of empowering the regions distrust the process of decentralizing power, saying it would only create many fiefdoms writ large in the regions. It is true to a certain extent that while local autonomy has increased the capacity for local self-rule, the stranglehold of political dynasties over our provinces and towns has gotten stronger through the years. So while political centers have become more dispersed under the 1987 Constitution, these centers have become increasingly dominated by a few families. But the Bayanihan Federal Constitution hardcodes anti-dynasty provisions with no need for an enabling law. It also provides for state-financed election campaigns, campaign finance reforms as well that limit the size and sources of political donations, and provides extra safeguards in the auditing of these sources of campaign expenses. Despite many forms of political patronage in Congress being done away with through programs that provide free universal access to public services like health and education, the stranglehold of public office by our political dynasties will remain unless people fight to democratize who can run for office with these reforms. Otherwise, the entry cost of running and winning at elections will just be too high. It creates a problem, an adverse selection problem, where only the corrupt can afford to run for office, win, and then stay in office. Thus, only the corrupt will choose to run for office. The honest people won't. Hence the rise of political dynasties that have a tighter grip on power now compared to 1988 when they first re-emerged. The Marcos era was but an interregnum between the dynastic oligarchies of the pre-war era, of the post-war era, and the resurrection post-EDSA. In between, Mr. Marcos stripped the oligarchies of power, but had to fill the vacuum that they left behind by appointing his own cronies to replace them. The classic case of a monarch who appoints men on the make to replace the traditional barons of the land to maintain control. We've seen how problematic that is, especially when the leader grows weak and dies. So rather than turning to strongmen, it is best to empower ordinary people to seek public office and win. Giving every Juan, and I mean Juan as in the name Juan, giving every Juan an equal chance to run through state electoral campaigns and political party reforms by instituting term limits and bans on political dynasties would bring about cleaner politics and better, more effective and accountable governance, and make everyone more equal before the law. So now we come to the problem of how to effect these changes. Many pro democratic opponents of federalism don't oppose bringing government closer to the people as such. They're, what they're fearful of are the other possible changes that opening a can of worms like charter change might bring, including erosions to our system of checks and balances by lifting term limits and so on. One way of bringing about these changes is to introduce federalism by stealth. A mere inclusion of the word regions in the definition of political and territorial subdivisions of the Republic under Article 10, Section 1 of the present Constitution could pave the way for the formation of autonomous regional governments. This would fulfill the vision of the framers to have a maximum autonomy short of federalism. The enabling law for a regional government code would only need a majority of both houses once the amendment has been made. Performing a surgical change to the Constitution in this manner, rather than an open-ended constitutional convention, would achieve the same goal of federalism, but without too much divisiveness or disruption, which is what economic managers fear. It would deliver federalism in everything but name. Article 17, Section 1 of the Constitution says, any amendment or revision to it may be proposed by Congress and passed with 3/4 of all its members. To avoid legal problems down the track, it's best to interpret this as 3/4 of both houses voting separately. Thus, some opposition senators might come to party if a surgical revision is proposed in this manner, as the shift isn't tied to term extensions. The problem is such a surgical amendment wouldn't come with the political and electoral reforms found elsewhere in the Bayanihan draft. Pushing for too many amendments to the Constitution could prove too taxing for Congress, and there might not be enough time to debate them with Duterte's remaining time in office, especially if the amendments become controversial with some congressmen who might oppose the ban on political dynasties. A people's initiative could deliver several amendments and bypass Congress, but this would require organization and funding to be achieved. It has one virtue, though. A people's initiative could bring about changes undiluted by political realities in Congress. The political and electoral reforms contained in the Bayanihan Constitution that would deal with political dynasties, campaign finance, and political party reforms would not need to be watered down to gain the support of 3/4 of each house. The resources required to, for want of a better term, buy votes in Congress to get the 3/4 required will be eliminated. Getting the people behind it will be difficult, but not impossible. Consider that the Pulse Asia survey of June 2018 showed that close to 30% of Filipinos wanted a shift to federalism at that time. The fact of the matter is, you only need 12% of registered voters and 3% from each district to sign a people's initiative to put it to a referendum. Thus, there's already sufficient support for federalism to sponsor a people's initiative. Now, if you consider that another 30% were open to a shift to federalism, quote, sometime in the future, and 10% were undecided or perhaps willing to be convinced of the need, then there might be enough support to pass the changes through a referendum. The downside is that all of this will require mobilization without the machinery of traditional politicians who will balk at the anti-dynasty provisions. Coco Pimentel, the president of PDP-Laban, and Manny Pacquiao have said that they would push for the Bayanihan draft, leaving out the judicial reforms, which is a different debate altogether. The question is whether the dynastic politicians that are members of their coalition led by Hukbong will fall in line, especially if Sara Duterte is opposed to it, as she has stated she is. If they're opposed by their own party mates, are they willing to sponsor a people's initiative? Much will depend on the president's position. But if he sits back as he is wont and doesn't provide direction, then this is where the push for charity change, as well as political and electoral reform, could fail. I doubt whether federalism would pass in the lower house if Hugpong is against it. A people's initiative might succeed with help from DILJ Undersecretary Jonathan Malaya, who was the convener of the PDP-Laban's federal study group, but liberal forces in the country need to get behind it, or else it too might probably fail. So there you have it. If the Bayanihan Constitution is debated in Congress, it will surely be watered down, its political and electoral reforms in particular, and in fact may result in unlimited terms for congressmen and the president. If it goes through a people's initiative, on the other hand, the reforms might have a better chance of remaining intact, but the challenge will be to get it going without the political machinery of those who run the country. As the song goes, change don't come easy. But let's think of the concept of Bayanihan for a minute here, which isn't just a local tradition or custom, but a collaborative ethos that could drive much needed reforms. If we put the term Bayanihan into practice, it might allow the forces seeking genuine and positive change to move forward. So that's where we'll have to leave it today. This has been another edition of The Cusp. Thank you for listening. See you next time.